The smell hit her before she'd even left the hallway, sweat and vanilla. It was the cheap oil Sable rubbed into her collarbones every morning, mixed with the damp, musky smell of Rehan's room. Maeve paused in the doorway. She didn't gasp. For a full 3 seconds her brain just refused to recognize the shape of the blankets. Sable stopped laughing, in mid-breath. Rehan scrambled backwards, his knees getting caught in the sheet, which he pulled off the mattress as he tried to get up. Maeve. He held his hands out in front of him, palms forward, like he was trying to back a stray dog out of a kitchen. Hold on, this was not planned. She glanced at his neck. A new dark bruise blossomed just above his collarbone, right where the skin was thinnest. Sable pulled her knees up to her chest, covered her lap with a pillow, and looked anywhere but at the door. Neither had even considered throwing the deadbolt. Tomorrow's the draft, Rehan said. His voice was quick, rising at the end of his sentences. You know what the council does to a pack that looks unstable just before selection. Dad, we have to be a united front now. It was all stress. It means zip. He was already thinking about the PR. That detail made her stomach churn. Not the cheating, but the instant frictionless switch to pack politics while he was still standing there half naked. Maeve, seriously, Sable mumbled from the bed. She sounded small, but underneath was an edge of irritation, as if she were the one inconvenienced by the interruption. Take your boots off my chest of drawers, Maeve said. Her voice was thin and dry, as though she hadn't had a drink of water all day. Rehan came closer to her. Where are you off to? The bells had sounded curfew. She made him no answer. She turned and went out the front door, leaving it wide open behind her, and the freezing night air rushed straight into his bedroom. The cold bit her hard in the alley, through her thin canvas jacket, but she maintained an even pace. Every broken cobblestone and blind corner in the lower scavenger district was known to her by muscle memory. If she called out here, some local thug or drunken street boss would hear it and see an easy mark. Her jaw stayed locked until her teeth hurt, her eyes fixed on the dirty frost coating the street lamps, all the way back to her lean-to. The lean-to was colder than the alley, but the door had a heavy iron latch she had put on 3 years ago. Dropping the bolt, she slid down the rough wood of the door and sat on the dirt floor in the dark. For 20 minutes or so, she did nothing whatever. She glanced at the rusty stove in the corner. Then she crawled to the far wall, dug her fingers into the gap under the baseboard, and prying up the third-floor stone, inside were 4 little bottles of glass, wrapped in an old rag of woolen cloth. The blood inside was dark and thick, diluted with enough saline to pass a basic visual inspection if her bad ever got dumped by a border guard. That was her only real currency. Raw, it could pull someone out of the 3rd stage of Silver Blight. Diluted, it kept the local healers from asking why the scavengers in her alley never got the lung rot that killed half the lower district every winter. If her father or anyone on the council discovered she was a walking, self-replenishing supply of broad-spectrum immunities, they'd lock her in a basement with an IV drip and a feeding tube until her marrow gave out. She jammed the vials back into the dirt and let the stone fall. 3 times somebody knocked on the door with the butt of a heavy staff. The latch rattled on the frame. Maeve stood. She wiped her palms on her pants, opened the door with her foot braced behind it. There was an enforcer in a heavy wool coat in the alley. He didn't look at her face, but pushed a stiff piece of yellow parchment through the gap in the door. Maeve of the Yards East, he said. He was chewing a piece of dry root, and his jaw clicked rhythmically. You're on the manifest for the Dawn Gates. 1 bag, no guns. Her eyes darted to the paper. The ink was hardly dry. I didn't make it in the lottery pool this year. My labor tax is paid through November. Talk to the clerks at the gate, he said, turning away to walk down to the next row of shacks. Or not. But if you ain't on the wagon by sunrise, the dogs drag you there by your ankles. The wind caught the door and it slammed against her boot. Maeve glanced at the yellow parchment beneath the dim glow of her street lamp. Her name hadn't been printed in the press. They'd written it in by hand, squeezed under the rest of the roster, where some other name had been scraped off with a razor. We need to come together right now. Rehan's father was on the regional draft committee. Someone in the upper wards had paid good money to buy their daughter off tomorrow's death list, and Rehan had given them a scavenger who had no family left to make an inquiry. She didn't attempt to sleep. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the ugly shade of purple on Rehan's collarbone. so instead she spent the night cleaning her boots and checking the seams on her coat. By 4 o'clock in the morning, her body began processing the adrenaline. Her hands shook so badly she dropped her canteen twice while filling it from the rain barrel, and there was a tight, hot pressure behind her sternum that felt like she'd swallowed a stone. She curled up on her blanket and took slow breaths for 5 seconds each, until her heart stopped pounding in her chest. She took up a light bag, extra socks, a roll of dried beef she'd been saving for winter, and the 4 vials wrapped in rag cloth, jammed deep into the hollowed-out heel of her left boot, where the wood was thickest. The enforcers took their time with the paperwork, letting the line stand in the freezing mud while they drank hot tea from thermoses by the guardhouse. Every few minutes a whip cracked in the loading bays, then the metallic rattle of a livestock ramp dropping against a truck bed. Maeve balanced on the balls of her feet, timing the guards' rotation patterns. 2 at the left gate, 3 around the processing tables, 1 sniper at the low roof of the freight shed. Then the racket in the front of the yard ceased. The quiet rippled back along the line like a wave, till even the enforcers by the tea station stopped talking and stood at attention. There was a covered platform, 40 feet above the loading pens, hung with the heavy black and silver fabric of the central capital. Most of the people up there were council members and local merchants, drinking from insulated cups, pointing down at the crowd as though they were picking cattle at a winter auction. The man at the front rail wasn't drinking anything. He wore a dark field coat, with no medals or insignia of rank, and no one within 5 feet of him seemed willing to intrude on his peripheral vision. Alpha King Torin seemed a few years younger than his portraits on the currency, but he stood with his jaw clenched tight, glaring down at the mud like he was utterly, tired with routine, bored with the entire show. He was not watching the crowd for fun. He looked like a man waiting for a certain problem to take care of itself. The pain in Maeve's chest flared hot, a sudden spike behind her ribs that made her catch her breath. She jammed her heel into the dirt to try to stretch her back out. Torin shifted his weight up on the platform. He tilted his head, over the processing tables, over the guards, over the first 3 rows of conscripts. He stopped near her. This was no casual swipe. 50 yards of floodlights and diesel smoke, and his eyes locked on hers. Maeve's first instinct, 10 years of alley inspections had drilled it into her, was to drop her chin and look down at her boots. She did not. She looked straight back up at him, squinting slightly against the glare of the lights behind his platform. His eyes never flickered, never wandered to talk to his aides. The boredom slumped off his shoulders and he straightened an inch, watching her through the gray morning fog. "You, 412, move your feet." An enforcer hit Maeve's shoulder with the flat of his clipboard, shoving her toward the narrow cattle chute that led to the transport trucks. She staggered forward and pressed against the wet iron railings, letting the crowd push her towards the shadowed back of the vehicle. She reached the ramp, without a backward glance at the black and silver banners. The gates slammed shut behind them, and the noise of the transport yard was cut off. They shepherded the line down a concrete hallway, lit by bare bulbs overhead that smelled like bleach and wet sheep. A row of clerks sat down behind a long folding table, with stacks of ledgers, none of them looking up from their ink. Name. The clerk had no hair, and his thumb was blue with the stamp pad. Maeve, Eastern Yards. He dragged his finger down a printed page, paused, frowned at the blank line above her thumb. Late edition. Roster override was midnight. Who'd you override from? Not my desk. He took a square of white canvas out of a cardboard box, with numbers stenciled in black paint. Tribute, 412. That's you now. Never mind the other name. Ignore the other name. The ink on this ledger was still wet when Rehan had looked her in the eye and told her about the pack needing a united front. His family hadn't just bought off a draft line, it scrubbed someone's daughter out of the system and dropped Maeve into the slot because she didn't have a father to file a complaint at the district hall. She accepted the patch. It was stiff canvas with the smell of vinegar and sizing. 5 feet away, a guard was leaning against a stack of crates, talking to the desk supervisor. Pulled the manifests himself this time. Generally lets the council rubber stamp the lower districts. Half the names from the east were personal. Maeve stuffed her hands into her pockets and kept walking. They put her in a concrete room with a floor drain and a bench bolted to the wall. At 7 the iron bolt rattled and Rehan came in. He looked like he had slept in his shoes. Wind had reddened his eyes and there was a gray shadow of stubble on his jaw. "They weren't gonna let me back in till shift change," he said, walking toward the bench. He reached out to take her arm, but she didn't move her feet, only 2 inches to the left, so his hand landed in empty air. "Rehan, why are you here?" "To tell you we didn't know about the paper." His voice sounded too loud in the small room. "My father did the override. I figured he just paid the labor fine to clear Sable's sister. I didn't know he put your registration number in the exchange." "You knew he wanted a name." "That's something else. Is it not?" He paused, his throat worked as he swallowed, and his eyes went to the small wire-glass window in the door. "Maeve, if my name is connected to an illegal substitution just before the beta trials, the council will take away my family's trading license. We shall lose the Upper Terrace house." And it was there. He hadn't brought an appeal form down here. He'd come to make sure she wouldn't scream out his father's name at the cameras during the opening roll call. "I'm not talking," she said. He let out a long, slow breath that dropped his shoulders 2 inches. "I'm going to fix this, Maeve. As soon as the preliminary rounds—" "I won't talk," she said again, her voice dead against the concrete. "Because nobody on that platform cares what a scavenger thinks about the registry. Not because I care about your house." She peered through the glass at the guard. She didn't glance back at Rehan until the iron door clicked between them. Before dawn, they moved the tributes into the lower holding pens. It wasn't a room. It was under the grandstands, a long brick tunnel smelling of horse piss and old hay. They were about 60 souls, wedged in between timber supports. Some were crying. Most sat on their bundles, staring at the floor. Maeve sat down on an upturned bucket next to a girl with a ragged scar through her left eyebrow. She bit her thumbnail, spitting the bits of horn onto the dirt. "Got a sponsor tag?" "No," Maeve said. "Me either." "Means we're padding." The girl nodded her chin at a group of 6 men and women standing by the staging gates. They wore matching gray windbreakers, and their boots were clean. District volunteers top. They get 3 days' rations in the chute before the gate opens, and their families get tax-exempt for 5 years if they last the week. Then the land goes back to the council. What if they don't? Basic math. Something heavy rolled over the floor of the grandstand, and the ceiling timbers shook above them. The noise of the crowd filtered down through the floorboards, a dull, steady rumble, like a river over boulders. A horn blew at the other end of the tunnel. It wasn't music, just a blast of compressed air that rattled the iron hinges on the pens. "That's us," the girl said. She got up and wiped her hands on her thighs. "Don't go straight at the boxes, but the cameras like to follow the first ones out, and the upper district boys usually throw something heavy just to get on the screens." Maeve touched the heel of her boot, felt the hard shape of the glass vials through the leather, and fell into line behind the girl's gray sweater. They didn't swing the gates. They hauled them up on rusted chains that screamed against the iron pulleys. First, the light off the white sand, so bright Maeve had to squint through her eyelashes to see the ground. The arena was an ancient stone stadium, 3 football fields long, surrounded by 40-foot concrete walls with iron spikes along the rim. The stands were jammed. They ate sausages wrapped in paper and drank beer out of plastic cups, shouting down at the sand as if they were at a dog track. A voice blared from the banks of horns riveted to the walls, rattling off numbers so fast the words blurred. 312, 401, 412, 415. Maeve pulled up 10 feet from the gate. She looked beyond the cameras along the fence line, up to the covered box at the 50-yard line. Torin sat in a metal folding chair near the rail. The men around him were leaning over the balcony with field glasses down at the sand. He was just watching the shoot. He watched her come out of the shadow of the arch. He didn't nod, didn't lift his hand, but he shifted his weight forward, his elbows dropping onto his knees as he followed her across the dirt. From the center pit, a compressed air mortar was fired, sending a cloud of red smoke 30 feet into the air. The crowd went crazy, screaming until they were hoarse. 40 people started running in from all around Maeve towards the timber piles in the middle of the field. She did not run for the timber. She turned right, ran toward the drainage ditch running along the south wall, her eyes on the gap between 2 concrete abutments, where the shadows were deep enough to hide a girl in a gray coat. The morning assembly was a surprise. They sounded 3 long notes on a low-note horn, the signal for the administrative lineup, not the combat one. Maeve joined the other surviving tributes, counting boots automatically as they shuffled onto the sand, noticeably less than yesterday. They had swept the deadfall from the arena floor. There were camera crews on a makeshift timber stage where a council handler held a clipboard and read names for the morning broadcast. Tribute 412 makes it through another cycle. Sponsors take note. Simply housekeeping disguised as entertainment. Maeve stared at the concrete wall behind the stage, staring at the drainage grates. Then she saw a face 2 rows away, and her brain just stopped. Rehan. For 3 seconds she really thought she was seeing things from lack of sleep. But when she blinked, he didn't vanish. He had on a clean tribute coat with a stenciled number over the breast pocket. His jaw was locked, staring straight at the scaffolding, not daring to look at her side of the crowd. He'd been taken. No, she thought of that and cast it away. Rehan's family had just bought a girl's name off this very roster 3 days ago. A beta heir with his father's council connections doesn't find himself on the dirt by accident. Someone had placed him there. She sat through the rest of the announcements watching him. As the assembly broke up and the enforcers began herding them back to the perimeters, Rehan's eyes flicked to an officer standing near the edge of the stage. Rehan nodded once, tight. The officer did not return the nod. He only glanced at his watch and walked away from the platform. Maeve didn't understand how the arrangement worked exactly, but her gut told her the math was off. She walked back to the trees with her head down. Rehan looked into her eyes once, and then the crowd intervened. He didn't look guilty like he had in the concrete room. He wasn't scrambling for excuses. He looked like a man who had determined upon some unpleasant proceeding. That was more terrifying than his cowardice had been. The arena soon plunged into darkness as the stadium lights went out, and the crowd trickled from the upper tiers. Maeve sat beneath her pine log, her skinning knife across her knees. The air shifted slightly, a cold draft against the wind, and she knew she was not alone. She didn't grasp the handle. Her ears knew the tread already. Torin stepped out of the brush, no guards behind him. He was wearing a dark canvas coat, and the only thing she could tell from the red LED lights was that none of the perimeter cameras were aimed at this section of woods. "You shouldn't be out here," she said to him. Her voice sounded thinner than she wanted. "Doesn't that violate your own rules? The king don't stick around in the dirt after hours. I do a lot of things I ain't supposed to," he said. He crouched down a few yards away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her space. "You looked like you had something to say today in the lineup. You did not." He had been watching her. She was starting to realize that very little went on in the dirt that he didn't know about. "Rehan is here," she said. "The boy his family put my name down on the roster." Torin didn't seem surprised. His face only tightened a little, like he was adding a new piece to a board he was already looking at. "You think there's a connection?" "I think I saw him make eye contact with a council handler today, and he looked like he had made up his mind to do something he knew he couldn't take back." He didn't laugh it off or accuse her of paranoia. He just watched her in the darkness. "You asked me something in that basement room," she said, pulling her collar up against the wind. "Why I was worth rescuing." "I asked what I was protecting," he corrected, "not why." Same difference. He did not speak. For the first time his habitual attitude of administration wavered a little. "This throne was not meant for me." She remained silent, letting him speak. "My brother was the heir," he said, his voice falling to a low level. "He'd been trained for it, all his life. I was never meant to sit in a skybox, watching lower district kids kill each other to keep the merchants happy." "What became of him?" "Long story," he said, and let it drop without sounding angry about it. "The thing is, I got handed a system built by liars, and I spent the last 10 years trying to figure out how much blood it takes to keep it from collapsing." She thought of the vials in her boot, tucked away. "Then we're in the same boat, stuck with things we didn't ask for." He looked at her in the shadows. They stayed in silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the wind whispering through the needles and the distant heavy hum of the stadium's generators. Maeve spoke first. She was tired of holding everything in, and she didn't have the energy to play defense anymore. "I didn't tell you something," she said, "about why Rehan's family really wanted me out." Torin did not budge, and he waited. "My blood is not normal," she said, the words heavy and awkward on her tongue. "It cures the Silver Blight, Not a treatment that retards it, a cure that lasts. For a long time he said nothing. The silence stretched on until she began to prepare herself for the usual shift. The exact moment someone stopped looking at her as a person and began to look at her as a medical asset. It didn't. That's why they scrubbed your name, he said softly, working the math out loud. It was more than a political favor. If the word went around that a lower district scavenger had a permanent cure for the blight, it would ruin the medical economy, she finished for him. Her voice was toneless. Rehan's family owned 3 pharmacies. Their money comes from selling treatments that keep people sick long enough to buy another bottle. And a free cure wandering around the eastern yards would kill their business overnight. His jaw clenched. This was the first time she had seen him really pissed off. That ain't politics, Maeve. They're making a cover for a body count. Hearing him say her name without his official tone made her chest hurt. You don't look at me any differently, she said. Should I? Everyone else does. She looked at her hands. I could see them doing the math in their heads. When I let it slip once, even to save a neighbor's life, I keep expecting you to start working out my value per liter. He looked her over carefully. I already know what you're worth. It is no matter of your blood. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just looked at her boots. Before either of them could say another word, a sharp double-beat drum sounded from the upper stadium walls, the signal for an emergency council session. Torin turned his head to the sound. His face hardened again and took on the usual cold, administrative expression. They've called an emergency meeting, he said, rising. That don't happen unless somebody made a thing. What kind of problem? He looked down at her one final time and then turned towards the trees. The kind where someone noticed I'm keeping you alive. Before dawn, rumors came to the camps. She'd heard it through the tribute grapevine. The same kids who told her the king was helping her were now passing along a very different message. The council is furious. They say the king is repairing the floor. They want her out. She sat on her rolled blanket under the pine log, trying to see how much time she had left. One of the boys from the southern terrace came to her camp, just long enough to drop a warning. They're saying you're the reason the council sat up all night. I hear you're in a paired round today. It's a random draw, but it's going to be a grinder, he said. Random, she said again. That's what the script says, the boy muttered, walking away before anyone saw him near her. She sat alone in the gray morning. That ache behind her ribs was back, cold and heavy. Torin's help had kept her off the tripwires, but had also put a spotlight directly on her back. If the council couldn't kill her with the automated hazards without fighting the king, they'd use the schedule. She thought of Rehan standing resignedly on the platform yesterday. She thought about the handler nodding to him. By noon, an enforcer came into her camp and gave her a yellow notification slip. He stared, blankly. Next round matchups, he said. Order of the council, random selection. She opened the paper. The sheet had 2 names printed on it. Tribute 412, and just below that, Tribute 206, Rehan. She stood in the frozen dirt, the paper in her hand. It wasn't random. They had set up a neat, homey execution on the arena sand and called it a lottery draw. She folded up the slip and placed it in her pocket. They want a show. She'd give them a show. But she wasn't going to die for their broadcast feed. She found him before he found her. It felt like the first clean win of the day. She disappeared through the iron grate, and Torin was alone in the dark end of the service tunnel. He was already looking toward the door, and when he saw her, his shoulders dropped, just a bit. He didn't ask about the yellow notification slip in her hand. He knew her face well enough. You saw the pairing, he said. 206. They told me it was a random draw. Council directive. It was no accident. His jaw locked. The same cold look he'd had when he'd talked about his brother. They can't get you out of the arena unless they can prove I've been fiddling with the wiring. So they staged a local fight that appears like a bad break, not an execution. I know, she said. That's why I have come down here. He stared at her in the yellow tunnel light. Tell me what you have come to say. On the 20-minute walk from the camps, she'd decided how much to tell him. She stood there, listening to the hum of the overhead pipes, and knew that halfway measures weren't going to buy her anything. Everything, she said. The cure for the blight. What it does for real when you don't cut it with saline. How fast it heals a wound. Why Rehan's family will lose their trading licenses and their upper terrace house if people find out they've been sitting on a treatment that really works. That's what this draw is all about. It's no longer just an illegal draft name. It's about burying the medicine. Torin stayed put. He looked at her, and his face changed from strained to something like surprise. You're sure about the family? I've watched them buy up dispensaries in the lower yards for years. I'd rather you know the whole layout now than try to figure it out after they clean up the dirt. He stood silent a long moment, listening to the water drip somewhere down the tunnel. At last he said flatly, I can't stop that fight tomorrow. Not without breaking the arena charters. If I go on the dirt when a pairing is running, the council has the legal right to remove me from the platform. And once I get off the platform, there's nobody who can stop them from taking you apart in a medical lab. It scared her to hear him say it out loud, but it cleared the air too. I didn't tell you to stop, she said, looking straight back at him. He wasn't promising to save her. He wasn't feeding her Rehan's excuses about timing and politics. I want you to know the truth, so they can't bury it with me. How I deal with Rehan on the dirt is my business. His face flickered with a look, not relief, but quiet understanding, as if he finally knew who he was up against. Then live with it, he said. I'll be watching the feeds. I will not turn my back to it, but I will not intervene either. And through the night, the arena work crews rebuilt the center floor into a maze of stacked concrete barriers and tight gravel channels. Made for close combat, it blocked vision to the trees beyond. Maeve moved down the corridors with her knife out, checking dark corners and overhead ledges. She'd spent the early morning hours talking to the older tributes about how the maze pairings usually worked, but none of their advice prepared her for what she found 40 yards in. It was a pressure plate, buried just beneath loose gravel at the sharpest turn in the channel. She squatted down next to it, her weight on her heels. She had spent years stripping condemned buildings in the lower yards of copper wire and pipe. She knew basic mechanics. This wasn't a standard arena trap. The spring tension dialed low, calibrated to snap the second a runner planted their foot to take the corner at speed. It was built to her weight, made to look like a bad step on camera. Custom job. She could have switched off the pin and walked past. It was her oldest instinct. Fix the problem, leave no trace, be invisible. Then she recalled Torin's voice in the basement. I won't look away from it either. If there were drone cameras overhead, pulling the pin quietly would just mean the council would say she got lucky and they'd rig something worse for the next round. She didn't pull the pin out. No, she stooped and grabbed a 20-pound lump of broken concrete from the foot of the wall, stepped back 3 paces, and threw it straight at the middle of the plate. The mechanism snapped with a loud metallic crack. From the false wall, a rusted iron blade swung out, slammed into the concrete block, showered the gravel with sparks, and jammed in the track. Maeve didn't run. She advanced on the jammed blade and stared straight up at the camera drone hovering 20 feet above the channel, and pointed her knife at the fresh grease on the custom spring mechanism. Let the announcers explain to the crowd why a random obstacle had brand new machine parts in it. She turned and walked down the gravel path, her heartbeat steady and clean. This time, for the first time since she'd been drafted, she wasn't just trying to survive the machinery. 5 minutes later, she located the bottleneck. 2 concrete channels met to form a narrow drainage gate, the sort of place you'd wait if you wanted to be sure someone couldn't circle around you. Sable stood next to the iron grill. She wore a gray wool coat and a green official lanyard around her neck. Her hands plunged into her pockets. Maeve stopped at 10 feet distance. Not on roster. I've got clearance, said Sable. Her voice was cool, missing the whine she used to pull when she wanted Maeve to cover her shift. The badge grants me access to the lower corridors whenever I want. It's part of the payoff. Don't look at me like that. Sable stepped forward. Do you seriously think Rehan and I just happened to run into each other? You think a scavenger girl gets a job working as a handler up on the terraces because she's cute? She laughed dryly, shortly. 3 months ago, his father paid my sister's back taxes. All I had to do was tell him who you were talking to, where you kept your stash, and if you ever got sick. Maeve's boots crunched on the gravel. How long? Since the winter freeze. You were an assignment, Maeve. You made it easy. You wanted a family so bad you didn't ask why I kept hanging around your alley. It hurt worse than the scene in the bedroom had. That betrayal had seemed like sloppy, careless greed. It was merely accounting. And Rehan? Maeve asked, her voice even. Did he know from the beginning, or did he just go by his old man's schedule? Ask him yourself, Sable said, glancing over Maeve's shoulder to the bend in the concrete channel. He's the one who signed the contract. Maeve didn't look around. She only heard the heavy, familiar sound of boots crunching on loose gravel behind her. Rehan emerged from the shadows, a short hunting sword in his right hand. This time he didn't look like he was going to throw up. His face was grim and gray, and his eyes were on her chest, not her face. "They paid her to watch you," said Rehan, his voice dropping in the narrow concrete space. "They paid me to see that you didn't leave the dirt." "You're not here to win the round," Maeve said, measuring the distance that separated them. "You're just here to close the account." Rehan's jaw quivered. For a second, the old panicked boy showed through the surface. Then he shut it off. "I'm sorry, Maeve, but my father needs the books to be balanced before the audit tonight." Sable moved back toward the iron drainage grate, removing her hands from her pockets to show Rehan she wasn't going to get in the way. Maeve didn't look at her again. Maeve took 2 slow steps back, away from the narrowest part of the channel where Rehan's sword would have the advantage, luring him out into the wider gravel pit where she had room to move her feet. "Your father needs a lot of things," Maeve told him, her eyes on his right wrist. "He should have hired somebody that knew how to fight in the mud. Don't make this harder than past to be." His voice broke a little on the last word, showing the strain. "You don't get to call it business after sleeping in my bed." He came at her, the sword swung in a wide, clumsy horizontal arc to cut her off at the knees. It was terrace school fencing, designed for flat gym floors and clean mats. Maeve dropped her weight and let the blade whistle 3 inches over her hood, and drove the heel of her boot right into his lead kneecap. He tripped badly, his boot skittering across the loose gravel, but he caught himself against the concrete wall before she could follow up with the skinning knife. This time he swung faster, and caught the sleeve of her canvas coat, cutting through the cloth and into the skin of her forearm. It hurt. A cold, sharp burn, but she didn't pull away. She caught his sword arm at the wrist with her left hand, and used his own momentum to thrust his shoulder into the concrete barrier. The sword clanked onto the gravel. Maeve kicked out his other leg, dumping him on his back in the dirt. She found herself sitting on his chest, with the point of her skinning knife buried in the hollow of his throat. He froze, chest heaving under her knees, bloodshot eyes looking up at the metal blade. He smelled of vanilla oil and sweat. She could have stopped it then and there. One quick shove and the beta heir would never balance books for his father again. She did not move the knife. She looked down at his gray face and knew she did not want his blood on her hands. Killing him wouldn't get her Allie back. It wouldn't undo what Sable had done. It would only make her look like the animal his father told the council she was. From the top of the stadium wall, a siren shrieked, a shrill 2-tone emergency blast that froze the crowd noise in its tracks before she could get to her feet. Rehan looked over her head at the skybox terrace, eyes widening. Maeve tilted up her chin to see where he was looking. 4 enforcers were struggling to keep Torin from the rail on the 50-yard balcony. He'd taken off his coat, and his lead guard was on the floor with a broken nose, and his face was stripped of every bit of administrative control he'd ever shown her. He wasn't looking at the council. He was looking down straight into the gravel pit, his hands gripping the iron balcony rail so tightly that the metal was bending. He was violating the arena charter in front of 10,000 people. Rehan opened the batting. He needed only the half-second she took to look up at the balcony. He slammed his shoulder into her chest, knocking her off balance, and scrambled out from under her with a frantic, thrashing desperation. She got her feet back under her, but this time she was slower. Her muscles shook with weariness, and Rehan knew it. He pushed forward, the short sword slashing in tight arcs, forcing her back toward the concrete wall of the channel. Above them the balcony was becoming a fight. She heard the sharp, formal voice of a councilwoman rise above the crowd noise. "Ancient law forbids the king from setting foot on the dirt during an active pairing. Stand down or you lose the succession." Whatever Torin said back was lost in the closing distance of Rehan. Maeve ducked under a high swing, but it was half a second too late. The iron blade caught her forearm, severing deep into the muscle. The pain was immediate and hot, and it numbed her hand. Her boots slipped on the loose gravel as she staggered back, and her knees finally gave way. "Stay down," Rehan said. He was above her, sword raised, panting. His voice cracked as though he were about to weep. "Please, Maeve, just stay down so I can make it quick." She looked up at him, pressing her left hand against the cut on her arm to keep the blood from coming out. "You'll have to swing it, Rehan. I ain't doing your work for you." There was a loud pop from the public address speakers high above the stadium, and the giant broadcast screens bolted to the walls went completely black. Someone in the control room had cut off the main feed. No one outside the stadium was watching anymore. Rehan grasped the sword with both hands. His arms shook so badly, the blade quivered in the air. She prepared herself for the iron to hit her. Nothing occurred. Gravel crunched under boots. Sable stepped from behind the corner barrier, hands out of her pockets, and stopped 3 feet from where Rehan stood frozen, sword over his head. He can't do it. Sable sounded tired and disgusted, like she was watching a kid fail a simple math test. All that talk in the terrace house, and he still can't finish a contract. Then do it yourself, said Maeve. Her voice was growing thin. Blood was quickly pooling in the gravel under her elbow. I'm not paid to get my hands dirty. Sable looked at her. Besides, it doesn't matter if Rehan kills you here. The council already knows what's in your blood, Maeve. I gave them the whole breakdown yesterday morning, after I saw you fix that kid in the trees. The words landed on Maeve's chest, colder than the wind. They don't care about the betting pool anymore, Sable said, staring at her thumbnail. There is a medical extraction team in the lower tunnel right now. They're taking you to the regional lab once the enforcers clear the field. They'll take what they need from you whether you're awake or not. It stole everything Maeve had spent 10 years hiding under a stone in the slums. Sable traded it for a lanyard, for an upper terrace, and tax exemption. On the 50-yard balcony, a man's voice cut through the shouting. It was Torin, screaming her name, just her name, no title, rough and strained against the guards who held him back. She wanted to think it had some meaning. But she was just lying there, her arm bleeding out, her ears starting to ring from the blood loss. And she just felt stupid for thinking an upper district king was going to ruin his life over a conscript. Sable turned and headed back to the drainage gate. Rehan stayed where he was, his arms dropping slowly to his sides, looking at the short sword, as if he didn't know where he'd got it. Maeve couldn't get her legs underneath her. Cold was beginning to creep up her fingers and into her shoulders, the sides of her vision starting to blur out with gray. Above the pit, the councilwoman's voice drifted clear through the empty stadium seats. You cross that rail, you lose every legal claim you have to this land, the woman said, stating the law in a flat administrative monotone. Every trade deal, every council seat, every veto. You dump the girl, and this is hushed up as an arena fatality. You step down onto the dirt, and you're standing in a holding cell right next to her. Maeve closed her eyes and listened to the quiet. She knew how these things worked. She'd seen men in the lower yards sell their brothers for an extra ration. Everyone gets the deal that keeps them out of the rain when the price is right. She waited for him to step away from the railing. No. Instead, the gravel under her cheek began to vibrate. It was not a voice. A low, heavy rumble that began in the concrete foundations of the stadium and worked its way up through the stone, a sound so thick she could feel it in her teeth. The councilwoman broke off mid-sentence. What are you doing, my lord? Guards, get the cuffs. The sound boomed to a roar that shook the iron light fixtures on the walls. Maeve just managed to lift her heavy eyelids as a shape cleared the balcony rail 50 yards away. It was no man falling. It was something big and black, moving far too fast for a 50-foot drop. The thing hit the gravel 20 yards away. The impact felt like a mortar shell going off, sending a cloud of stone dust and dirt 10 feet into the air. It wasn't an ordinary territorial wolf. It was huge, easily 400 pounds of heavy muscle and coarse black fur that seemed to absorb the stadium light instead of reflecting it. It was an ancient bloodshift, the kind of old, unstable lineage the council had banned from public display 40 years ago because it didn't look like an animal, it looked like a monster. Rehan dropped his sword and stumbled backward, screaming as he tripped over a concrete block. The beast closed the distance in a single bound. It didn't tear his throat out or make a show for the dead cameras. It just slammed a heavy paw into Rehan's chest, pinning him flat against the dirt, with enough force to crack the windpipe without breaking it, leaving him gasping and helpless in the stones. Then the head turned toward Maeve. She didn't try to crawl away. Her instincts were usually good at telling her when to run. But looking up at the luminous yellow eyes of the beast, she didn't feel afraid. She was only tired. The wolf came over to her, making not the slightest sound on the gravel. It settled its monstrous bulk onto the dirt beside her, blocking the cold wind and the view of the balcony from her bleeding side. "You broke the charter," she whispered. Her throat was like sandpaper. "Me." The beast lay quiet. It just pushed its warm shoulder against hers and made a low rhythmic thrum from its chest that vibrated against her ribs and chased the chill from her skin. Nobody said anything up on the balcony. Maeve rested her head against the rough fur of his leg. Darkness stole over her eyes, and she stopped trying to keep them open. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and clean linen. It took her a minute to realize she wasn't under the pine log anymore. That deep ache under her ribs had lessened to a throb, and her arm was tightly bandaged in clean gauze. She tried to sit up and realized she was in a small concrete room with an actual cot and a space heater in the corner. Outside the half-open door, people were talking. Their voices were low, but she knew the cadence. They weren't guards or council handlers. The tributes were from her section of the dirt. She swung her legs over the side of the cot and got up and walked to the door. Her boots were off, and she stood on the cold floor with her bare feet. The moment she pushed the door wider, conversation stopped. 5 tributes were seated around a folding table in the hallway. The girl with the scar through her eyebrow, the kid she patched up in the dry gully, and 3 others from the lower yards. She expected them to recoil or to look at her like a walking medical supply. The scarred girl walked over and handed her a square of white canvas. It was her old tribute patch, only someone had scribbled out 412 with black thread. Her real name was stitched underneath it in uneven letters. "We listened to the broadcast feeds before they cut the stadium screens," said the girl. "We know what the council wanted to do with your blood. Looked like it was time somebody else besides the king started watching your back." Maeve looked down at the stitches. Her throat was tight. "Why do you go out on a limb for that?" "Because half of us saw you give away medicine you could have traded for a terrace house," said the kid from the gully. His arm was still against his ribs, but he looked steady on his feet. "And because if they can drag you into a lab, and nobody stops them, they'll do the same to the rest of us whenever they need spare parts." The others nodded. It wasn't an army. It was 6 worn lower district kids in borrowed sweaters. But they weren't looking at her like she was some kind of con artist. "The public screens are still dark," Maeve said. "So the council is trying to get the paperwork sorted before they switch the cameras back on. If we want this to stick, we need to get the evidence on the fiends while people are still in the stands." The scarred girl said, "Sable's down in the holding cells. An hour ago she tried to sneak out through the service tunnels and was caught by the perimeter guards. She had a briefcase with her." Maeve folded the canvas patch and shoved it in her pocket. The hall lights flickered on when they reached the lower detention block. Someone had jumped the circuit breaker. The camera rigs attached to the ceiling were swinging back and forth, their red recording lights on solid. Whoever was in the control room wanted it on tape. Maeve walked up and 2 enforcers stepped back from a cell door. They didn't ask for her handler badge. Inside, Sable sat on a metal bench, her gray coat buttoned up to the neck. She seemed calm, but her eyes flicked to the bandage on Maeve's arm and lingered there a beat too long. "You're supposed to be in an extraction lab," Sable said. "I went the long way," Maeve said. Her voice was flat, trying for her usual bored tone. She stepped into the cell, leaving the door open so that the ceiling cameras could see them both. "You told me in the gravel that the council had an extraction team waiting. You said you had the paperwork showing Rehan's family also paid for the contract." "I say a lot of bullshit. You don't haul a briefcase through a storm drain unless you're trying to peddle what's inside." She looked down at the girl who used to borrow her sweaters. "I ain't here to argue with you, Sable. The council will take the blame for this as soon as those feeds go live. You hand over the contracts now, or you let them explain why your signature is on the expense ledger." Sable stood still for 10 seconds. She looked at the floor drain, doing the mental math she was so good at, figuring out which side of the room was safest. Then she put her hand in her coat, pulled out a thick envelope of folded green paper, and dumped it on the metal bench. "Initial transfer orders," Sable echoed. "Bank routing numbers, medical dispensary deeds, Rehan's father's signature on the lower district buyout. I'm on the line as a witness." Maeve lifted the envelope and stared at the top sheet. It was all there. The prices they'd paid to scrub her from the registry, to keep the blight medicine off the market. "Why give it up now?" Maeve said. Sable took a short, dry breath. "Because Rehan's dad owes me 3 months back pay. and I'm not going to sit in a penalty cell while he keeps his terrace house. It was no confession, and she was sorry it was not. It was simply survival. Maeve took the envelope and left the cell without a word of goodbye. 5 minutes later, the paperwork was on the broadcast feeds. Maeve stood at the window to the control room, watching the main stadium screens spring to life with high-res scans of the green transfer orders. Names and numbers scrolled across the glass, and the crowd noise in the grandstands went from a low rumble to a sharp, angry roar. Those who had bought the terrace seats were discovering that they had been purchasing costly blight cures from the same men who had buried the free cure. It should have felt like a win, but her chest was cold. An enforcer had just come back from the medical bay with word on Torin. He hadn't properly moved back. She shoved past the control room desk and ran down the basement stairs, her bare feet slapping hard against the concrete. She located the secure medical room, where 2 older healers in green scrubs were arguing softly over a metal table. Torin lay on the steel. He was human again, but his skin was the color of ash, and his breathing shallow and uneven. His hands shook uncontrollably, fingers clenching tightly into fists, and then relaxing every few seconds. "What's wrong with him?" Maeve walked between the healers. The senior healer didn't bother with bedside manner. "The ancient bloodline is unpredictable. 3 generations. It hasn't been bred clean." He pushed the shift without preparation and got the old genetic rot going. His own blood is rejecting his bone marrow. She gestured at the monitor. "We can keep him sedated, but we have no compound that can halt the cellular breakdown." Maeve looked at Torin's gray face. Without his field coat, he looked smaller on the table. Genetic decay. The same basic cellular decay that had caused the Silver Blight in the lower yards, only deeper down in an old bloodline. Maeve looked at the bandage on her left arm, then turned to the healer. "Get me a clean syringe," she said. The woman hesitated half a second, looked at Maeve's arm, then turned to the tray and handed her a sterile glass tube with a wide-gauge needle. "It might not bind to markers of the upper district." "Then we shall see," said Maeve. She stripped the gauze off her forearm, found a clean vein above the cut, and drew 2 full cc's of dark, uncut blood. This time she did not dilute it with saline. She bent over the table, took Torin's shaking hand to hold it steady, and pushed the needle right into the IV line that was running into his wrist. Before she could check whether the numbers on the monitor had changed, heavy boots pounded down the hall outside. "We have a breach in the lower corridor," a guard shouted through the open door. "Rehan has a guard's baton." He got out of the holding pen. Maeve put the empty syringe down on the metal tray and turned to the door. At the turn of the basement corridor, she found Rehan. He looked like shit. His tribute coat was torn across the shoulder, his face swollen where the wolf had pinned him, and he was swinging a heavy riot baton at 2 young enforcers, trying to corner him without drawing their service pieces. He was cornered. He had the wild look of a dog that knows it's about to be put down. "Get back," he shouted at the guards, the voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "My father is on the regional committee. You don't mess with me." Then he saw Maeve standing barefoot down the hall. He ceased waving his baton. His bloodshot eyes looked for her, and his face was contorted into something ugly and frantic. "This you did. We had the whole slate wiped clean." "You had to stay in the alley. Rehan, your father cleared the wrong name." She didn't draw a knife, just stood there in the middle of the hall, feet cold on the floor. He charged, swinging the stick high above his head for a wild 2-handed blow. He didn't take 3 steps. The scarred girl from the holding pens came out of a side doorway, crook-socked a canvas sandbag at the back of Rehan's knees, and dropped him hard on the concrete. 3 lower district tributes jumped on his shoulders before he could scramble up, pinning his arms to the floor and pulling the baton from his fingers. He made no effort to get up again. The scarred girl was on his legs, and he was flat on his stomach, and his cheek was on the cold floor, panting and swearing under his breath. Maeve came over, looking down at her. Her anger was gone. He just looked like one of those spoiled terrace kids who finally ran out of people to pay his fines. "Take him up on the assembly platform," she said to the enforcers who were coming over with the iron restraints. "Let the cameras have a good look at him while his father's bank records are still on the screen." She turned her back on him and went straight to the medical room. The senior healer was on a stool beside the metal table, watching the monitor as she pushed the door open. Maeve came in, and she looked up, her face relaxing for the first time all morning. "The cellular breakdown stopped," the healer said, pointing at the screen where the erratic lines had smoothed out into an even pulse. Whatever you had in your marrow, it stabilized his bloodline in 4 minutes. Maeve moved across the room and looked at Torin. The grayness had left his cheeks and his hands lay flat and still on the sheet. Outside in the stadium, the crowd was still screaming at the screens, demanding the council members come out of the skyboxes. The noise rattled the frosted glass of the window in its frame. But Torin was breathing steadily now, deep and even against the sheet. When the council met for the formal hearing, the area outside the stadium was a very different scene. The stands were no longer rooting for a show. The crowd was angry, talking loudly, while the big screens kept running the bank transfers Sable had turned over to them. Seeing the dates and amounts in black and white, it was clear the whole system was just a way to squeeze money out of the lower districts. Maeve stood near the side of the room, pressing her bandaged arm against her ribs. Guards dragged Rehan in, his hands tied. He wasn't resisting, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed. At the center table sat the councilwoman who had tried to talk Torin down at the arena rail. 2 enforcers were standing behind her chair, and she didn't look anywhere near as confident now. Her name was on the expense ledgers also. Tribute 206, read the presiding elder from a paper. You are accused of putting out a contract on another tribute during an active round. This is in violation of both arena rules and territorial law. Rehan didn't make any excuses. He just stood and took it. Maeve had thought she'd feel better watching it happen. Maybe vindicated. Maybe satisfied. Instead, she just felt tired. It was like watching an old debt get finally wiped. The council members in charge of paying this contract, the elder went on, pointing his chin at the woman in the center chair, are also responsible for hiding medical research that could have raised the Silver Blight in the Eastern Yards 3 years ago. Now that got loud in the room. The folks in the back started to shout. These were people who ran dispensaries. Half of them had lost family to the Blight. Maeve looked down the corridor to the medical bays. Torin was still out there, resting. She didn't want to leave the room, but she had to see this part finished with her own eyes. Several rows back, Sable sat, her coat buttoned, staring at the table, not a word. She'd swapped her testimony for life without a cell. The elder said, the court will now pass sentence according to the territorial law. Maeve did not smile. She simply transferred her weight off her bad leg and waited for the numbers to be called. Sentencing took 3 hours. That was just to go over the list of property seizures, revoked training licenses. Rehan was first. They took away his beta title, his family's terrace house, and their commercial permits. He wasn't sent to the penalty cells. The elder said Maeve hadn't put in for a death penalty, which she hadn't really thought about until he said it out loud. Instead, he was stripped of his registration and shipped down to the lower labor yards. He was going to have to learn to pay his own fines from now on. The guards led him away, and he did not glance back at her. She didn't know if that made it worse or better. Sable lost her handler badge, upper terrace housing stipend. Her cooperation kept her out of the labor gangs, but she was back to where she started before the winter freeze. The room was thinning out, and Maeve caught her eye near the door. You'll be all right. You know how to handle. Sable's face tightens a bit. Not that I deserved it. No, you did not. But it's you who has to live with the ledger now, not me. She didn't wait for Sable to respond. The council members suffered more. Their bank accounts were drained, property reverted to the territory, and their names were permanently removed from the voting rolls. It wasn't going to bring back the people who'd already died of the Blight, but it cleared the field. The elder had banged his gavel for the last time, and Maeve's legs ached from standing on the concrete. She went out into the corridor, heading straight for the lower medical block. Torin was sitting on the side of the cot when she shouldered the door open. He was wearing a clean gray shirt, and the color was back in his face. You're on your feet? Getting there. He nodded at her arm. The healer said I drained most of your blood supply. By 9, the stadium was empty. The floodlights were out, the public screens finally dark. Maeve sat in a wooden chair in Torin's private office above the stands, watching a small fire dance in the grate. The room was quiet, no crowd noise, no sirens, no broadcast horns. You jumped off a 50-foot rail, she said to the flames. You violated the charter in front of 10,000 people and almost killed yourself forcing an unstable shift. Yeah. He perched on the edge of his desk, sipping water from a tin cup. Why? He placed the cup on the wood. Because I got tired of people treating you like a line item on a spreadsheet. Somewhere between the cattle gates and the gravel pit, I decided that keeping you alive was more important than keeping the council happy. It was the most straightforward answer she'd had in 10 years. She didn't say anything, just looked down at her boots. The senior healer said that the cellular breakdown in my marrow isn't gone, Torin said. Your emergency transfusion stopped the immediate reaction. Yes, I do, she told me. It is a stopgap patch. Torin came over and stood before her chair. Then we'll fix it for good. Not with glass vials and saltine cuts from across the room. Maeve, I want the whole line cleared, even if that means tying the territory down to a scavenger from a lower district. She raised her eyes to him. She knew what he was asking. A full territorial bond wasn't just a medical procedure. It meant permanently tying their bloodlines together under the old codes before the council started writing contracts and buying names off draft lists. If we do that, there's no pulling out when the politics get loud, she told him. I'm stuck with you. I'm counting on it. Her bare feet stood on the rug as she took his hand. His skin was warm, his fingers not shaking anymore. There were no cameras in the room, and no one was taking bets on how it would play out. They just stood by the fire, letting the old unwritten rules work as they were meant to. When the fire had burned down to embers, the cellular rot in his marrow had gone, and Maeve stopped finally checking the door to see if anyone was coming to tell her she was in the wrong room. The scent of the arena hung in the eastern yards for a month. It wasn't all at once, but if you knew where to look, the changes were clear. The council seats were filled by district reps who actually lived in the wards they voted for. The arena floor was paved over, turned into an open market, and the medical dispensaries were doling out uncut blight medicine without requesting labor vouchers first. Maeve stood on the ancient viewing balcony above the gates and looked down at the crowd. She had a neat, clean coat of wool with no number stenciled on the back. Torin stepped out onto the iron floor and leaned against the rail beside her. Sounds noisy down there. It's supposed to be loud. People are actually buying food instead of paying fines. She saw the kid from the dry gully down by the old processing tables. His arm was healed, and he was unloading a crate of glass vials from the back of a truck. He looked up towards the balcony, met her gaze, and nodded once before reaching for another box. She thought of Sable out there on the edge of the labor yards, and Rehan learning to use a shovel. She didn't want them to die anymore, just didn't care what happened to them. They were off her slate. The district reps sent up the formal registration this morning, Torin said. They want to put your name on the charter of the territory, officially. She looked at him. The old sharp pain behind her ribs had disappeared completely, replaced with a steady, quiet rhythm that kept time with the noise of the market below. Luna, she said, tasting the word. In the mouth of the man who used to live under a leaking tin roof, it still sounded a little odd. If you want it. It's a lot of meetings. She laughed, a short, true laugh that surprised them both. I've dealt with worse people than district reps. She took his hand, her fingers twining with his on the cold iron rail. A truck backed into the loading bay below them, its brakes squealing against the drums, and a couple of market vendors began arguing over a stack of wooden crates. It wasn't quiet, and it wasn't neat.